Hello, today we're just going to take a brief look at the ascending and descending tracts in the nerve system. Firstly, let's have a look at the ascending tracts, so the sensory nervous system. The first pathway we're going to look at is the dorsal column pathway, which receives a number of different inputs from various sensory receptors. These can include Merkel discs, which provide light sustained touch, or Ruffini endings. These provide forces of touch and shear stress. Meissner corpuscles, which allow sensory of discriminate touch, and Pacinian corpuscles, which allow sensory of deep pressure and vibration, as well as joint proprioceptors. Proprioceptors allow us to determine our position relative to space. Now, the dorsal column pathway allows us to experience discriminate touch, vibration, and conscious proprioception. Let's have a look at the tract. So as you can see here, the dorsal column pathway can receive two types of input. Input above the level of T6 or below the level of T6. Above T6, we receive input from the dorsal column pathway on the facilis cuneatus. This is more lateral on the dorsal column, on the spinal cord. Below T6, we have the facilis gracilis. Now, both of these are ascending now as first-order neurons. They eventually synapse in the lower medulla on their respective nucleus and move off as second-order neurons heading towards the thalamus. Now, the dorsal column pathway is also termed the medial lemniscus, and that refers to this tract here. As you can see, the second-order neurons have synapsed in the thalamus on the VPL. VPL is just a part of the thalamus that provides a base for sensory information from the body to be transmitted via third-order neurons to the cortex. The dorsal column pathway is a 3-neuron chain. The dorsal column pathway is susceptible to a number of different diseases and deficiencies, such as infection, infarction, B12 deficiency, compression, or tertiary syphilis. Some of the consequences may include things such as pseudoathetosis, a writhing of the digits, hands and feet, or sensory ataxia, which can lead to positive Romberg signs and a stamping gait. The Romberg sign can be presented with a patient closing their eyes, holding their arms forward, and attempting to balance, so a positive sign will be them stumbling over. Next, let's look at the spinothalamic tract. The spinothalamic tract receives input from free nerve endings which allow pain and temperature to be transmitted. The spinothalamic tract also allows simple touch. Let's have a look at the actual pathway. So here we have again the spinal cord. The first order neurons will enter via the tract of Lesueur, where they will synapse in the REXT1 area onto second order neurons. They travel across the anterior white commissure where they decussate and then ascend. Again, they synapse on the thalamus, on the VPL. This is also termed the spinal lemniscus. From there, they move off as third-order neurons to the cortex, to the relevant part. So as you can see, this is also a 3-neuron chain. One common condition that might present is syringomyelia. Now, syringomyelia is a condition where the central canal of the spinal cord, as you can see, is enlarged. This can prove difficult for the spinothalamic tract when it's decussating across the anterior white commissure, meaning that you may lose sensation of pain and temperature and simple touch. Next, we have the trigeminothalamic tract. The trigeminothalamic tract is how the face receives its sensory input. As you'll see, there is a major difference between the sensory input of the body and that of the face. So first, the sensory input will enter via the cranial 5 nerve, the trigeminal nerve, and synapse on a very large nucleus, the cranial 5 nucleus. This occurs in the pons. Once decussation occurs, it ascends to the VPM of the thalamus, contrasting the others which synapse on the VPL, the thalamus. Now this is also known as the trigeminal lemniscus. Again, from here you will have various third-order neurons synapsing on various areas of the cortex. Now let's look at the spinocerebellar tract, which allows us to experience unconscious proprioception. This receives input from muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs. Let's have a look at the tract. Here we have various different inputs from various different regions of the body. The left upper limb and the left lower limb, for example, here. The point of decussation is not the main focus of this part of the tract. As you can see here, wherever it begins, regardless of decussation, it will always end up on the ipsilateral side, the same side of the cerebellum. Pure lesions of this tract are rare, but they can be seen in conditions such as Friedreich's ataxia, a autosomal recessive genetic disorder, which can result in malcoordination and a wide base gait. Pure lesions in this tract are rare, as oftentimes you can get motor damage in these areas. Now let's look at the motor tracts, otherwise known as the descending tracts. Firstly, we have the lateral corticospinal motor tract. Output is mediated by the primary cortex, the premotor cortex, and the supplementary motor area. This is involved in major voluntary skilled motor movement. The lateral corticospinal tract will descend through the posterior limb of the internal capsule. Let's look at the tract here. We begin in the cortex, and as it descends, we find that it decussates in the lower medulla to form the pyramids. As the upper motor neuron descends, it will synapse on a lower motor neuron. Lesions affecting upper motor neurons will often affect the cortex or the corona radiata or the internal capsule, the descending tracts, or the brainstem or spinal cord, whereas lesions at the lower motor neurons will often be at the level of the cell body of the lower motor neuron, the spinal cord, or the spinal nerve, the cauda equina, or they can have lesions in the peripheral nerves. Different symptoms are seen depending on the different motor neuron that's damaged. So if an upper motor neuron is damaged, you get spastic paralysis, clonus, there is no atrophy, there is hyperreflexia, and an extensor plantar response. This can be seen in such things as Babinski's sign. Whereas with a lower motor neuron, damage can present as flaccid paralysis, hyperreflexia, atrophy, and fasciculations, which are a type of muscle twitching. Now, spinal shock can mean that damage to the upper motor neurons can initially present with lower motor neuron signs. Now we have the ventral corticospinal motor tract. This also receives output from the primary motor cortex. However, it transmits minor motor movement. In comparison to the lateral corticospinal motor tract, we can see here that there is no decussation in the pyramids of the medulla. Rather, it only decussates once it reaches a level of termination. Now we have the lateral vestibulospinal motor tract, which receives output from the vestibular nuclei of the pons and medulla. They allow extensor muscle control. These are the muscles that allow you to stand upright and to effectively fight the forces of gravity. We can see here that this tract never decussates. As with the ascending tracts, the descending tracts have their own tract for the face. This is the corticobulbar tract. The corticobulbar tract has contralateral innervation as well as minor ipsilateral innervation. This means that damage can mean that all motor function is not lost. However, there is an exception to this, which is with cranial nerve 7. With the corticobulbar tract, you find that it passes through the genu region of the internal capsule. And there we have our ascending and descending tracts. Thanks for watching.